Deep in the forest, a camper encounters a lone wolf. The wolf's surprising behavior changes everything we know about these creatures. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the towering sequoias as Mark Peterson pulled his dusty Ford Ranger into the designated camping area of Yosemite National Forest. He'd chosen a spot far from the regular tourist zones, seeking the solitude that had become his only comfort these past months. The dashboard clock showed 4:47 p.m., plenty of time to set up camp before darkness fell. Mark's movements were mechanical as he unloaded his gear. 6 months of working at his corporate desk job had left him soft, and the weight of his backpack felt foreign against his shoulders. The camping equipment was all new, purchased in what his sister had called a classic post-divorce crisis. Maybe she was right, but Mark couldn't bring himself to care. The chosen campsite sat in a natural clearing, surrounded by ancient trees that stretched endlessly upward. Mark noted the thick carpet of pine needles beneath his boots, good padding for sleeping, though he brought a high-end camping mat anyway. The air carried the sharp scent of pine and recent rain, reminding him of camping trips with his father decades ago, before cancer took him too early. Setting up the tent took longer than it should have. The instructions were clear enough, but Mark's mind kept wandering to the last argument with Sarah. "You're never present," she'd said, packing her suitcase with precise, angry movements. "It's like living with a ghost." The tent pole slipped from his fingers, clattering against the others. He cursed, the sound echoing slightly in the vast space around him. As dusk approached, Mark focused on gathering firewood, grateful for the simple task. The forest floor provided plenty of dry kindling, and soon he had a respectable pile near his newly erected tent. The physical activity helped quiet the constant replay of memories in his head. The empty house, the mediation sessions, the final signatures on papers that ended 8 years of marriage. The fire came to life easily enough, crackling and sending sparks upward into the darkening sky. Mark sat on a fallen log he dragged near the flames, opening a can of beef stew he'd brought for dinner. The food was bland, but he barely noticed. His attention had shifted to the deepening shadows between the trees, where the day's last light created strange patterns and movements. That's when he first noticed something was different. The forest's ambient sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant calls of birds settling for the night, had suddenly diminished. Mark felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. Years of city living had dulled his outdoor instincts, but something primitive within him recognized the change in the atmosphere. He turned slowly, scanning the tree line, and froze. There, at the edge of the firelight's reach, stood a wolf. The animal was massive, larger than Mark had imagined wolves could be, with fur that seemed to shimmer between gray and silver in the flickering light. Its eyes reflected the flames, two burning points in the gathering darkness. Mark's heart hammered against his ribs. His hand instinctively reached for his hunting knife, then stopped. The wolf wasn't displaying any aggressive behavior. It stood perfectly still, watching him with an intensity that felt almost intelligent. Despite his fear, Mark found himself captivated by the creature's presence. It carried itself with a quiet dignity that commanded respect rather than terror. As they regarded each other across the firelit clearing, Mark felt something shift inside him. The wolf's appearance should have terrified him, should have sent him scrambling for safety. Instead, he felt an inexplicable sense of recognition. The animal's solitary presence in this vast wilderness seemed to mirror his own isolation, its watchful stance reflecting his own wariness of the world. Little did Mark know that this encounter would be the beginning of something far more significant than a simple camping trip. The wolf, whom he would soon name Luna, would become a catalyst for changes he couldn't yet imagine, leading him toward revelations that would reshape his understanding of both himself and the connections he thought he'd lost forever. The wolf took 3 deliberate steps toward the fire, its movements fluid and purposeful. Mark remained still, his half-eaten can of stew forgotten in his hands. Every survival instinct screamed at him to retreat into his tent, but something stronger kept him rooted to the log. The wolf, Luna, he decided, noting the almost ethereal quality of her fur in the firelight, settled onto the ground about 10 feet from him. "I must be losing my mind," Mark muttered, running a hand through his disheveled hair. The events of the past year had left him raw, questioning everything he thought he knew about himself. Now here he was, having a one-sided conversation with a wild animal. Luna's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, her head tilting slightly. "You probably think I'm crazy too," he continued, surprised by how natural it felt to speak to her. Successful marketing executive throws away his career to camp alone in the wilderness. He laughed, but the sound held no humor. Sarah would have a field day with this. She always said I was terrible at communicating, and now look at me, talking to a wolf. The fire crackled, sending a shower of sparks into the night air. Luna's eyes followed them upward, then returned to Mark with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. In that steady gaze, he saw none of the judgment he'd grown accustomed to seeing in others' eyes, his ex-wives, his colleagues, even his own reflection. "I used to come to places like this when I was a kid," Mark found himself saying, his voice growing softer. "My dad would take me camping every summer. We'd spend hours just being. No phones, no deadlines, no expectations." He poked at the fire with a stick, watching the embers dance. "Somewhere along the way, I forgot how to do that. Got caught up in quarterly reports and client meetings. Started measuring my worth in billable hours." Luna stretched out, resting her head on her paws while maintaining eye contact. The position made her appear less threatening, almost dog-like, though Mark didn't fool himself about her wild nature. Still, her presence had a calming effect he couldn't explain. "You know what the worst part is?" he continued, surprised by the words tumbling out. "Sarah was right. I wasn't present. I spent so much time chasing some abstract idea of success that I forgot how to actually live." He rubbed his face, feeling the rough stubble of 3 days without shaving. 15-year-old me would be so disappointed in what I became. The wolf's ears perked up at a distant sound Mark couldn't hear. For a moment, he thought she might leave, and the prospect filled him with an unexpected sadness. But Luna merely adjusted her position, settling back down as if she had all the time in the world. As the night deepened around them, Mark found himself sharing more than he had with any human in years. He told Luna about his father's death, how it had driven him to seek security above all else. He spoke about meeting Sarah in college, their shared dreams that gradually diverged under the pressure of his ambition. He described the hollow feeling of walking into their empty house after she left, how the silence seemed to mock all his supposed achievements. Luna listened with an unwavering attention that made Mark wonder if she somehow understood. There were moments when her eyes seemed to hold such intelligence, such awareness, that it almost frightened him. But beneath that fear lay something else, a growing sense of connection he couldn't rationalize. "I don't even know why I'm telling you all this," he admitted, tossing another log onto the fire. "Maybe because you can't tell me I'm being ridiculous, or that I need to move on like everyone else does." He paused, studying the wolf's serene expression. "Or maybe because you're the first one who's really listened in a long time." What Mark didn't yet realize was that this unexpected confession session was preparing him for something larger. Luna's presence wasn't just a coincidence, and the comfort he found in sharing his story with her would soon prove to be more significant than he could imagine. As the night wore on, neither human nor wolf moved from their positions, creating a tableau of unlikely companionship that would soon be tested by forces beyond their control. The first warning came as a subtle change in air pressure. Mark noticed Luna's ears twitch forward before he felt it himself, a shift in the atmosphere that made his ears pop. Looking up, he saw clouds racing across the previously star-filled sky, blotting out the moonlight in patches of advancing darkness. "That wasn't in the forecast," Mark muttered, his outdoor inexperience suddenly feeling like a glaring liability. The weather report had promised clear skies for the next 3 days. He'd planned around it, packed for it. The wind picked up, causing the surrounding pines to sway and creak ominously. Luna stood, her posture alert but not alarmed. Her eyes moved between Mark and the darkening sky, as if assessing the situation. The fire, which had been burning steadily, began to flicker wildly in the strengthening gusts. Sparks flew dangerous distances, forcing Mark to stamp out several that landed too close to his tent. The temperature dropped rapidly. Mark could see his breath now, forming small clouds in the increasingly turbulent air. He scrambled to secure his campsite, aware that he should have done this earlier. The tent stakes needed reinforcing, and his supplies lay too exposed to the elements. As he worked, he kept glancing at Luna, half expecting the wolf to disappear into the forest ahead of the storm. But she remained, watching his frantic preparations with an almost human-like concern. The first drops of rain fell like bullets, heavy and cold. Thunder rolled in the distance, and Mark's heart rate spiked with each boom. The storm was approaching fast, much faster than seemed natural. He'd never seen weather change so dramatically, so quickly. The rational part of his mind, the part that dealt with spreadsheets and profit margins, struggled to make sense of it. "I should get in the tent," he said aloud, though whether he was talking to Luna or himself wasn't clear. But even as he spoke, he knew the tent might not be enough. The wind had become fierce enough to bend smaller trees, and his lightweight camping gear suddenly seemed desperately inadequate. Luna moved closer to the fire, which was now struggling against the rain. To Mark's surprise, she positioned herself between him and the worst of the wind, her large form creating a small buffer against the elements. The gesture seemed so deliberate, so protective, that Mark felt a lump form in his throat. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, having to raise his voice above the wind. "You should be finding shelter." Another crash of thunder, closer now, made him jump. Luna remained steady, her presence an anchor in the chaos. The rain intensified, becoming a solid wall of water. Mark's fire sputtered and died despite his attempts to shield it. Darkness closed in, broken only by frequent flashes of lightning that transformed the forest into a series of frozen tableaus. Each flash illuminated Luna's fur in brilliant white, making her appear almost supernatural. In the darkness between lightning strikes, Mark felt his old anxieties rising. He was alone in the wilderness, in a dangerous storm, with a wild predator beside him. Every rational thought said he should be terrified. Yet somehow, Luna's continued presence kept his panic at bay. There was something almost mystical about the moment, as if the storm had created a bubble of time where normal rules didn't apply. A particularly violent gust of wind ripped one of his tent stakes from the ground. The structure began to collapse on one side, and Mark lunged to grab it. Rain soaked through his clothes instantly, but he couldn't let his only shelter be destroyed. To his amazement, Luna moved with him, bracing herself against the tent's other side, her weight helping to stabilize it. Working together in the storm, man and wolf against the elements, Mark felt something shift in his understanding of the world. All his life's carefully constructed barriers between human and animal, civilization and wilderness, control and chaos, seemed to blur. In their place, he felt a more fundamental truth emerging, though he couldn't yet put it into words. The storm raged on, but Mark no longer felt its victim. With Luna beside him, the chaos became something else. Not a threat, but a cleansing force. Unknown to him, this tempest was more than just a weather event. It was a crucible, forging a connection that would lead to revelations he couldn't yet imagine, and changes he never expected to face. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the clearing in harsh white light. In that frozen moment, Mark caught Luna's eyes fixed on him, and a memory surfaced with startling clarity. His grandmother sitting by the fireplace, telling stories of spirit animals and ancient connections between humans and the wild. "When the world speaks to you," she'd said, her wrinkled hands wrapped around a cup of tea, "it rarely whispers." As a child, he'd loved these stories. As an adult, he dismissed them as fairy tales. Now, soaked to the bone and standing beside a wolf in a raging storm, those words carried new weight. The wind howled through the trees with increasing fury, but Mark's fear had transformed into something else. His grandmother's stories flowed back to him in fragments. Tales of people finding their true selves in moments of crisis, of animals appearing as guides when humans lost their way. He'd forgotten these stories in his rush to become successful, to be practical. You always said the spirits had their own way of teaching. Mark spoke into the darkness, remembering his grandmother's smile. Luna pressed closer, her fur brushing against his leg. The contact should have frightened him, but instead, it felt like an anchor in the chaos. Another crash of thunder, so close it made the ground vibrate. Mark's corporate life, which had seemed so important just days ago, now felt like a distant dream. What had he really gained from all those extra hours at the office? What had he lost? The storm's intensity matched his internal turbulence as years of suppressed questions rose to the surface. His hand found Luna's fur, wet but warm. She didn't flinch at his touch. If anything, she leaned into it. "You're not just a wolf, are you?" he asked, though the howling wind swallowed his words. The question wasn't really meant for Luna anyway. It was part of a larger realization forming in his mind about connection and purpose, about the stories we tell ourselves and the truths we choose to ignore. Lightning flashed again, and in its brief illumination, Mark saw something that made his breath catch. All around the clearing, pairs of eyes reflected the light. More wolves, watching silently from the tree line. They stood like sentinels, neither approaching nor retreating, creating a circle around Mark and Luna. Fear should have overwhelmed him, but Mark felt only a profound sense of witnessing something extraordinary. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. "Sometimes we need to be surrounded by what we fear to find what we've lost." The corporate executive in him wanted to rationalize this experience, to find some logical explanation. But the part of him that was awakening knew better. The storm reached its crescendo, rain falling so hard it seemed solid. The other wolves remained in their circle, visible only in lightning flashes. Luna stayed pressed against Mark's side, both of them now drenched but somehow sharing warmth. In this moment of elemental chaos, Mark felt more clarity than he had in years. He thought of Sarah, of their last conversation. "You've lost yourself," she'd said, not in anger but in sadness. "The man I fell in love with used to see magic in the world." At the time, he dismissed her words as romantic nonsense. Now, standing in a storm surrounded by wolves, he understood what she meant. The revelation hit him with the force of the thunder. He hadn't come to these woods to escape. He'd come to remember. Remember the boy who believed in his grandmother's stories. Remember the young man who once promised Sarah they'd never let success change who they were. Remember the part of himself that knew there was more to life than quarterly reports and corner offices. Luna's presence beside him felt increasingly significant. This wasn't just a chance encounter with a wild animal. It was something his grandmother would have called a message, delivered not in whispers but in thunder and lightning, through the eyes of a wolf and the fury of a storm. What Mark didn't yet realize was that this moment of clarity was just the beginning. The storm's lesson wasn't finished, and Luna's role in his life would extend far beyond this night. The circle of watching wolves, the raging storm, and his unexpected guide were all part of a larger pattern, one that would eventually lead him back to connections he thought were lost forever. The storm continued its assault, but Mark stood straighter now, one hand buried in Luna's fur, feeling more alive than he had in years. He was still far from understanding everything, but he knew with certainty that nothing would be the same after this night. As the storm's intensity gradually decreased, the pounding rain softened to a steady drizzle. The other wolves had melted back into the darkness, leaving only Luna beside Mark. His clothes were soaked through, but he barely noticed the discomfort. Something was pushing him to document this moment, to capture what felt like a pivotal point in his life. Mark remembered the leather-bound sketchbook in his backpack, an impulse purchase he'd made at an art store last week. He hadn't drawn anything in years, not since college when art was his minor, before practical considerations led him to focus solely on business. With slightly trembling hands, he retrieved the sketchbook from his pack, thankful it had stayed dry inside its waterproof covering. Luna watched him intently as he settled back down, her eyes reflecting the rekindling fire he'd managed to restart with dry wood from beneath his tense vestibule. The wolf's pose was regal, almost deliberate, as if she understood his intention. Mark's hands moved across the paper with surprising confidence, muscle memory from years ago taking over. "Stay still," he murmured, though Luna hadn't moved an inch. His first strokes were tentative, trying to capture the wolf's essential form. But as he continued, something shifted. The technical skill he'd abandoned years ago began to flow back, enhanced by a new depth of perception. He wasn't just drawing Luna's physical form. He was capturing something more profound: the dignity in her bearing, the intelligence in her eyes, the strange sense of purpose in her presence. The sound of pencil on paper mixed with the diminishing rain and the occasional distant thunder. Mark lost track of time as he worked, adding details that spoke to more than just appearance. He drew the way Luna's fur caught the firelight, how her eyes seemed to hold ancient wisdom, the subtle ways her presence had transformed the wilderness around them from threatening to sacred. As he drew, memories surfaced. Art classes he'd loved, dreams he'd abandoned, conversations with Sarah about following their passions. "You used to see the soul in things when you drew them," she'd told him once, looking at his old sketchbooks. "I miss that way you had of seeing the world." He dismissed her nostalgia then, focused on climbing the corporate ladder. Now, with each stroke of his pencil, he felt like he was rediscovering that lost way of seeing. The drawing expanded beyond just Luna. Mark found himself capturing the storm-swept clearing, the ancient trees bending in the wind, the interplay of shadow and firelight. He added the circle of watching wolves from earlier, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. The scene took on an almost mythical quality on paper, yet it felt more real than any of the reports or presentations he'd created in the past decade. Luna shifted slightly, moving closer to observe his work. Her proximity should have been unnerving, but instead, it felt natural. Mark found himself adding to the drawing the feeling of her fur against his hand, the warmth of her presence in the cold night, the way she'd stood with him against the storm's fury. "I used to believe I could capture the essence of things," he said softly, adding subtle shading to Luna's eyes. "Somewhere along the way, I started thinking that was childish. That growing up meant seeing only what was practical, measurable." He paused, studying his work. "I was wrong, wasn't I?" The wolf's steady gaze seemed to confirm his words. The drawing was nearly complete now, but it was more than just an image. It was a testament to transformation, a visual record of the moment everything changed. Mark added a few final touches, the way the remaining raindrops caught the firelight, the subtle suggestion of something magical in the air. Looking at the finished piece, Mark felt tears welling up in his eyes. The drawing captured not just the scene but the feeling of the night, the fear, the wonder, the profound sense of awakening. It was proof that the part of him he'd thought lost was still there, waiting to be reclaimed. What he didn't yet realize was that this artistic resurrection was another piece of a larger puzzle. The drawing would become more than just a memory of this night. It would be a key to understanding the strange series of events still to unfold. Luna's presence in his art, like her presence in his life, was both an end and a beginning, the closing of one chapter and the opening of another he couldn't yet imagine. Mark carefully closed the sketchbook, protecting it from the last drops of rain. The storm had passed, but its impact lingered in the charged atmosphere and in the changes it had wrought within him. Dawn wasn't far off, and with it would come new revelations, but for now, he sat in contemplative silence beside his unlikely guardian, feeling more authentic than he had in years. The first hints of dawn appeared as a subtle lightening of the eastern sky, turning the clouds from black to deep purple. Mark had stayed awake through the remainder of the night, watching Luna and processing everything that had happened. His body was exhausted, but his mind felt surprisingly clear, as if the storm had washed away years of accumulated mental fog. The forest began to wake around them. Birds cautiously resumed their songs, and the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, creating golden shafts that pierced the lingering mist. The light transformed the destruction left by the storm into something almost beautiful, broken branches and scattered leaves glittering with raindrops, the whole forest seemingly renewed. Luna stood, shaking off the night's dampness from her fur. The morning light revealed colors in her coat that Mark hadn't seen before, subtle variations of gray and silver that seemed to shift with each movement. She looked toward the rising sun, then back at Mark, her posture suggesting it was time for departure. "You're leaving," Mark said, feeling a complex mix of sadness and gratitude. PSTO. as well, his muscles stiff from the night's ordeal. "I need to go too. But this isn't the end, is it?" The question wasn't really about Luna. It was about everything the night had awakened in him. As he began to pack up his campsite, Mark's mind was already racing with possibilities. His position at the marketing firm, which had once seemed like the pinnacle of success, now felt like a cage. He thought about the environmental nonprofits that had approached his firm seeking pro bono work, requests he'd always delegated to junior staff. Now he saw opportunities he'd been blind to before. "I could use my skills for something that matters," he said aloud, carefully storing his sketchbook in his backpack. Luna sat watching him, her presence still commanding attention. "All those connections, that network I've built, it could be used for conservation, for protecting places like this." The idea gained momentum as he spoke it aloud. His experience in corporate marketing could be valuable to environmental causes. He knew how to reach people, how to change perceptions, how to build support for ideas. He'd just been using those skills for the wrong purposes. "Sarah always said I had the power to make a difference," he continued, rolling up his tent. "She saw something in me that I'd forgotten was there." The memory of his ex-wife no longer brought the usual pain. Instead, he felt a strange sense of gratitude for how her departure had forced him to confront his lost path. Luna moved to the edge of the clearing, but didn't leave. She seemed to be waiting for something. Mark finished packing, then pulled out his phone, surprised to find it still had power. The screen showed several missed calls and messages, but what caught his eye was an email newsletter he'd been ignoring for months. Updates from a wildlife conservation group active in Yosemite. Standing there in the morning light, Mark made a decision. "I'm going to change things," he said, looking at Luna. "Not just for me, but for this place, for creatures like you." The words felt both like a promise and a prophecy. "Whatever happened here last night, whatever you are, I understand now. Some things are worth protecting, worth fighting for." Luna's eyes met his one last time, and in that moment, Mark felt the full weight of what had transpired. This wasn't just about career change or personal growth. It was about reconnecting with something fundamental, something humans have forgotten in their rush toward progress. But as he watched Luna finally turn and disappear into the forest, Mark didn't know that their paths would cross again, or that the connection they'd formed was part of something larger than himself. The changes he was contemplating would lead him down unexpected paths, bringing him full circle in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The sun climbed higher, fully illuminating the clearing. Mark shouldered his backpack, feeling lighter despite its weight. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, uncertainty didn't frighten him. He had found something in these woods, not just courage or purpose, but a sense of being part of something greater than himself. As he began his hike back to civilization, Mark had no way of knowing that his transformation was still incomplete, that Luna's appearance was more than a random encounter, or that the greatest revelation was yet to come. For now, he simply walked, carrying with him the night's lessons and the dawning promise of a new beginning. The main trail was muddy from the night's storm, with small streams of water still running down its center. Mark had been walking for about an hour when he heard voices ahead, confused, slightly panicked voices that echoed through the trees. Rounding a bend, he came upon a group of 5 tourists huddled around a soaked paper map. "The trail markers should be here," a woman in a red raincoat was saying, gesturing frustratedly at the map. "But nothing looks right after the storm." The others in her group looked equally distressed. 2 teenagers glued to their useless phones, and an older couple who seemed more concerned with keeping their balance on the slippery ground. Before his encounter with Luna, Mark might have hurried past, viewing their predicament as someone else's problem. Now he found himself stopping. "Need some help?" he called out, approaching slowly to avoid startling them. The group turned to him with visible relief. "Oh, thank goodness," the woman in red said. "We're trying to get back to the visitor center, but the storm washed out some of the markers, and our GPS isn't working right." Mark studied their situation with new eyes. In the past 12 hours, he'd learned more about paying attention to his surroundings than in years of casual hiking. The storm changed the landscape, he explained, pointing to subtle signs he'd started noticing during his own walk. The way certain branches bent, the pattern of morning light through the trees. But the forest tells you where to go if you know how to look. The teenagers looked up from their phones, suddenly interested. Mark found himself sharing what he'd learned about reading the natural world. Not just the practical tips about navigation, but deeper insights about connecting with the environment around them. "Last night taught me that we're not separate from all this," he said, gesturing to the forest around them. "We're part of it." He pulled out his sketchbook, showing them his drawing of Luna and the storm. The group gathered around, their earlier panic forgotten as they absorbed the image. "You saw a wolf?" one of the teenagers asked, eyes wide. "Weren't you scared?" Mark considered the question carefully. "I was at first," he admitted, "but fear comes from not understanding. When you take the time to really see something, really connect with it, fear turns into something else, something better." As they began walking together, Mark found himself sharing more about his night's experience, carefully omitting the more mystical elements that might sound too fantastic. Instead, he focused on the practical lessons: how to stay calm in a crisis, how to read the forest signs, how to find strength in connecting with nature rather than fighting against it. The woman in red introduced herself as Maria, a high school science teacher. "You speak about nature the way my indigenous students do," she observed. "Like it's alive, conscious, trying to communicate with us." "Maybe it is," Mark replied, helping the older couple over a fallen tree. "We've just forgotten how to listen." He shared his newfound resolution to work in conservation, and Maria's eyes lit up. "My students would love to hear about this," she said. "We're studying ecosystem interconnection, but it's hard to make it feel real to them." She paused, then added, "Would you consider coming to speak to my class?" The request surprised Mark, but not as much as his immediate desire to accept. Before last night, public speaking had been just another business tool. Now he saw it as a way to share something vital, something that might help others avoid the disconnection he'd experienced. As they walked, the group's dynamic shifted. What had started as a simple rescue became something more, a sharing of experience, a passing on of newly acquired wisdom. Mark found himself talking about things he'd never discussed before: the importance of maintaining connection with the natural world, the dangers of letting career success override personal growth, the unexpected ways life could guide you back to your true path. The teenagers had put their phones away, actively engaging in spotting the natural markers Mark pointed out. The older couple shared their own stories of transformative experiences in nature. What could have been a stressful journey became something approaching a pilgrimage. What Mark didn't realize was that this encounter wasn't random either. These people, their presence in the trail at this exact moment, were another thread in the tapestry being woven around him. Maria's classroom would eventually play a role in the larger revelation still to come, though he couldn't have guessed how. As they finally approached the visitor center, the forest thinning ahead of them, Mark felt a familiar presence. Looking back, he caught a glimpse of silver-gray fur between the trees. Luna, watching from a distance. None of the others noticed, but Mark understood. His role was changing, from someone who needed guidance to someone who could offer it to others. The visitor center parking lot appeared through the trees, its asphalt still wet from the storm. Mark bid farewell to the tourist group, exchanging contact information with Maria and promising to follow up about speaking to her class. As they parted ways, he felt a curious mixture of reluctance and anticipation. Reluctance to leave the forest's embrace, but anticipation for the changes he knew were coming. The lot was nearly empty, most visitors having delayed their plans due to the storm. Mark's Ford Ranger sat where he'd left it, water droplets catching the late morning sun on its dusty surface. The sight of his vehicle, this artifact of his ordinary life, felt somehow discordant after the night's experiences. Walking toward his truck, Mark noticed subtle differences in how he moved, how he perceived his surroundings. Even this manufactured space seemed different. He noticed the way nature encroached on the parking lot's edges, the persistent weeds pushing through cracks in the pavement, the bird calls echoing off the visitor center's walls. The boundary between civilized space and wilderness felt less defined than it had yesterday. Everything's connected, he muttered to himself, reaching for his keys. We just pretend it isn't. His hand touched the truck's door handle, and he paused. Something felt off. The vehicle looked exactly as he'd left it, but some instinct, perhaps sharpened by his night with Luna, told him something had changed. Opening the door carefully, Mark immediately spotted it. A small wooden box sitting on the driver's seat. His heart rate quickened. He was certain he'd locked the truck. The windows were all intact, showing no signs of forced entry. Yet there it was, a box about 6 inches square, made of dark wood polished to a soft sheen. Mark looked around the parking lot, but he was alone. Even the tourist group had disappeared into their own vehicles and driven away. The only movement came from a pair of ravens watching from a nearby tree, their black eyes unervingly intelligent. Picking up the box, he felt its weight, surprisingly heavy for its size. The wood was warm to the touch, as if it had been sitting in sunlight, though his truck had been in shade. No note, no explanation, no sign of who had left it or how they'd gotten into his locked vehicle. What is this? He wondered aloud. The ravens cawed in response, the sound echoing across the empty lot. Mark looked up at them, reminded suddenly of his grandmother's stories about ravens as messengers. After last night, such thoughts didn't seem as fanciful as they once had. He settled into the driver's seat, holding the box in his lap. His fingers traced the subtle carved patterns on its surface, patterns he gradually recognized as stylized wolves running in an endless circle around the box's edges. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each wolf unique, yet part of the flowing whole. Mark's hands hovered over the lid. Part of him, the cautious, corporate part, said he should report this to park security. An unknown package in his locked car should be cause for alarm. But another part, the part that had spent the night in communion with a wolf during a storm, knew this was something else entirely. The fact that he felt no fear about the box's appearance struck him as significant. Just as Luna's presence had felt right despite all logical reasons for terror, this mysterious delivery felt like the next step in whatever journey had begun last night. Before he could open it, his phone buzzed to life, finally finding sufficient signal to receive delayed messages. The screen lit up with notifications, missed calls from work, emails from clients, and most surprisingly, a message from Sarah. His finger hesitated over her name. The box sat in his lap, its carved wolves seeming to move in the shifting sunlight. The ravens continued their vigil from the tree. Mark felt suspended between two worlds, the familiar one of deadlines and responsibilities, and this new realm of mystery and meaning he'd stumbled into. What he didn't yet realize was that the box, the message from Sarah, and the strange circumstances of their arrival were all connected. The next few moments would set in motion the final pieces of a puzzle he didn't know he was solving. The greatest revelation still awaited him. But first, he had to make a choice about which world to trust. The rational one he'd always known, or this new one that seemed to operate by different rules entirely. Mark took a deep breath, his hand still hovering over his phone, the box's weight substantial in his lap. Whatever he chose to do next would determine far more than just his immediate future. The ravens watched, patient and knowing, as if they understood exactly what hung in the balance. Mark chose the box first. Something about its presence felt more urgent than the messages on his phone, more connected to the transformative night he'd just experienced. With careful movements, he lifted the lid. The hinges moved silently, as if recently oiled. Inside, nestled on a bed of deep blue velvet, lay a silver pendant on a leather cord. The pendant was crafted in the shape of a wolf's head, its details so precise it seemed almost alive. But what caught Mark's breath wasn't the craftsmanship. It was the eyes. 2 small sapphires had been set as the wolf's eyes, and they held the exact same shade of blue as Luna's. Lifting the pendant, he noticed an inscription on the back, the letters flowing in an elegant script. Proteja, ok, ame, protect what you love. Below the Portuguese words was a date, April 15th, 1987. Mark's hands began to tremble. That was the date his grandmother had arrived in America from Brazil, carrying with her the stories and traditions that had shaped his childhood. A small piece of paper lay beneath where the pendant had rested. The handwriting was immediately familiar, the same flowing script his grandmother had used in all her letters. But this note was new, the ink still fresh. When the guardian appears, the path reveals itself. Some bridges can be rebuilt, if we are brave enough to cross them again. Mark's mind raced. His grandmother had passed away 5 years ago. The paper looked newly written, the ink barely dry. He looked up at the ravens, still watching him intently. "What's happening?" he whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was asking. His phone buzzed again, insistent. This time he looked at Sarah's message. "Mark, I know this will sound strange, but I had a dream about you last night. You were in a storm, but you weren't alone. I need to tell you something important. Maria just called me. Yes, the same Maria you met on the trail. Please call when you can." The coincidence was too precise to be chance. Maria, the teacher he'd just helped, somehow knew Sarah, and Sarah had dreamed about the storm. Mark's hands went to the pendant, its weight somehow both foreign and familiar against his palm. He remembered more of his grandmother's teachings, stories she'd told about spirit animals and their role as bridges between worlds, not just between humans and nature, but between people who had lost their way back to each other. She'd always said that true love, like true wisdom, never disappeared. It just waited for the right moment to return. The sapphire eyes of the pendant caught the sunlight, throwing blue reflections across the trux interior. Mark thought about Luna's eyes, about Sarah's message, about Maria's appearance on the trail. Pieces of a puzzle were falling into place, but the complete picture remained just out of reach. His grandmother's stories had often mentioned guardians, spirit animals that appeared when someone needed guidance. They weren't just guides through physical wilderness, she'd said, but through the wilderness of the heart. When you're most lost, she would say, that's when the guardian finds you. The pendant felt warm against his skin as he put it on. The ravens took flight, their wings making no sound as they disappeared into the forest. In their wake, Mark caught a glimpse of something moving between the trees. A flash of silver gray fur that vanished before he could be sure it was real. His phone buzzed one more time. Another message from Sarah. "I'm at the cafe near the park entrance, the one where we had our first date. If you're ready, there's something you need to know about Luna." Mark's heart stopped. He had never mentioned Luna's name to anyone. The wolf pendant seemed to grow warmer against his chest, its sapphire eyes holding secrets yet to be revealed. The final pieces of the mystery were about to fall into place, but first, he had to find the courage to face what awaited him at the cafe. What Mark didn't know was that the next hour would not only explain the mysterious events of the past day, but would also rewrite his understanding of everything he thought he knew about his past, his relationship with Sarah, and his grandmother's legacy. The guardian had appeared, the path had revealed itself, and now it was time for the final truth to emerge. The cafe looked exactly as Mark remembered it, a rustic building with large windows overlooking the park's entrance. 7 years ago, he and Sarah had sat at a corner table, talking for hours about their dreams over cooling cups of coffee. Now, as he pulled into the parking lot, he saw her sitting at that same table. His phone buzzed with yet another message, this time from an unknown number. The guardian leads, but only love completes the circle. The style was his grandmother's, but the number was registered to the Yosemite Wildlife Research Center. Taking a deep breath, Mark touched the wolf pendant for reassurance and walked into the cafe. Sarah looked up as he entered, her eyes immediately going to the pendant around his neck. She didn't seem surprised to see it. "You found her," Sarah said simply, her voice carrying both certainty and relief. "Luna found you." Mark sat down, noting the familiar sketchbook on the table between them. Not his new one, but an old one he thought he'd lost years ago. "How do you know about Luna?" he asked. "What's going on, Sarah?" Sarah opened the sketchbook to a page Mark immediately recognized. There, drawn in his own hand during their first year of marriage, was Luna. Every detail exactly as she appeared last night, down to the distinctive pattern around her eyes. The date on the sketch was April 15th, 2017, exactly 30 years after his grandmother's arrival in America. "Your grandmother gave me this before she died," Sarah explained, her fingers tracing the drawing. She said I'd know when it was time to return it. Last night, during the storm, I knew. She paused, meeting his eyes. But you need to hear the whole story. Maria? Mark turned to see Maria, the teacher from the trail, approaching their table. She wasn't wearing her red raincoat anymore, but rather the uniform of the Yosemite Wildlife Research Center. Hello again, Mark, she said, sitting down. Or should I say, hello for the third time? Third time. Maria pulled out her tablet, bringing up a photograph that made Mark's breath catch. It showed a much younger version of himself, maybe 7 years old, standing in these same woods. Beside him was a silver-gray wolf with distinctive eyes. The photo was dated April 15th, 1994. Your grandmother brought you her. After your father died, Maria explained. You were having a hard time processing the loss. That's when Luna first appeared. You drew her then, too, though you probably don't remember. Your grandmother knew you'd need Luna again someday, so she made arrangements. Arrangements? Mark's head was spinning. Sarah took over. Your grandmother was more than just a storyteller, Mark. She worked with the Wildlife Center for decades, helping to protect the wolf populations here. Luna is part of a very special pack, one that's been here since before the park was established. Your grandmother helped keep them safe, and in return, they became guardians, Maria finished. Not just of the forest, but of certain people. People who need to find their way back. To themselves, to each other, to what really matters. Mark's hands went to the pendant. The box in my truck? Your grandmother left it with us, Maria smiled, along with instructions about when to deliver it. She said we'd know the right moment. And last night, during the storm, every wolf in Luna's pack began howling at exactly midnight. Sarah reached across the table, taking Mark's hand. I've been volunteering at the center for the past year, she said softly, trying to understand what your grandmother was trying to tell us all along. About connection, about protection, about love. When Maria called me this morning about meeting you on the trail, I knew it was time. The night your father died, Maria added, Luna stayed with you until sunrise. Your grandmother said she'd never seen anything like it. That's when she knew you had a special connection to this place, to these wolves. She spent the rest of her life making sure the connection would be there when you needed it most. The final piece clicked into place as Mark remembered something. The way Luna had protected him during the storm, just as she had when he was a grieving child. The way she'd led him back to this moment, this revelation, this chance to rebuild what he'd thought was lost. Your grandmother had one last message for you, Sarah said, pulling out a sealed envelope. She said to give it to you only after Luna had brought you back to yourself. As Mark opened the letter, a photo fell out, his grandmother standing with a much younger Sarah, both smiling, with Luna sitting between them. The date was their wedding day. The letter contained just one line in his grandmother's flowing script. Some love stories need a guardian to find their way home. The pendant warmed against his chest, and through the cafe window, Mark caught a glimpse of silver gray fur disappearing into the forest. Luna's work was done, at least for now. The guardian had led him back, not just to Sarah, but to himself, to his grandmother's legacy, and to a purpose bigger than he'd imagined. Sarah smiled, tears in her eyes. So, want to help me and Maria protect some wolves? Mark looked at the photo, the pendant, and the woman he'd never stopped loving. I think that's what I was always meant to do. Outside, a wolf's howl echoed through the trees. Not a goodbye, but a reminder. The circle was complete, but in many ways, their story was just beginning.